The sun blazed over the fortified walls of a Rajput citadel where drums of war had fallen silent after a bloody skirmish. Captured enemies, bound in chains, were dragged into the palace courtyard. Their faces were pale, their eyes darting toward the darkened entrance of a chamber that smelled faintly of damp earth and musk. The Maharaja sat high upon his carved sandalwood throne, his turban heavy with rubies. His gaze was cold, his fingers tapping against the hilt of his jeweled sword. In his voice was neither rage nor pity, as he decreed that the traitors before him would meet their end in the dreaded pit of snakes. The courtiers stirred uneasily, for even hardened generals seldom looked upon the pit without unease. It was an ancient punishment, older than the dynasty itself, whispered to have been inherited from the Naga cults of centuries past. The condemned, it was said, did not simply die. They were consumed by fear long before venom ended their lives. 2 guards pushed forward the first prisoner, a soldier accused of desertion. His body trembled against the ropes binding his wrists. He pleaded with words that turned to stammers, begging the king for mercy. But mercy was a coin the Maharaja never spent on those who betrayed him. A gate creaked open at the far side of the courtyard, revealing a spiral staircase leading down into the earth. The air that rose from below was heavy and sour, carrying with it the unmistakable hiss of serpents. A ripple of horror passed through the gathered onlookers. The prisoner was forced downward step by step, his legs buckling as the guards shoved him along. Torches lined the descent, flickering against walls carved with ancient serpent motifs. Each torch seemed to make the carved eyes glow with a sinister life of their own. When the staircase ended, the chamber opened wide into a pit hollowed out of stone. At its center lay a depression filled with writhing movement. Hundreds of snakes coiled over one another, their scales glistening like black oil. Cobras raised their hoods, their tongues tasting the air with menace. The man fell to his knees, his screams echoing off the stone as the guards cut his bindings and threw him forward. He staggered, his bare feet scraping the sandy floor. One cobra slid across his path, its body thick, its head rising slowly until its eyes locked with his. The crowd above watched in silence as the man stumbled backward. His breath came in ragged gasps. Each step he took only drew more serpents from the heap, their hissing swelling into a chorus that filled the chamber. Terror alone seemed to paralyze him, even before the first strike. One cobra lashed forward, its fangs sinking into his ankle. His scream rose to a shriek as venom burned its way through his blood. He clutched at the wound, but another snake struck his arm, then another at his thigh. Soon his body was a canvas of punctures, his cries echoing like a soul already lost. The Maharaja leaned forward on his throne, his lips tightening in satisfaction. This was not merely execution, it was spectacle. To him, fear was as sharp a weapon as the sword, and watching it consume his enemies reminded all present of the cost of defiance. Another prisoner was brought forth, this one a captured noble from a rival kingdom. Unlike the soldier, he walked with dignity, refusing to let his captors see fear in his eyes. He stared at the pit with a grim defiance, as though he would rather die than yield to the king's cruelty. Yet when he was lowered into the chamber, even his composure began to crack. The sound of hissing grew louder as snakes slithered from the shadows, curious about the new presence. He closed his eyes, whispering prayers to the gods, his voice trembling despite his effort at calm. The snakes coiled around him, brushing against his skin, testing him with their flickering tongues. The audience above leaned over the railing, holding their breath. To some, this was justice. To others, it was horror given form. But none dared to speak against the king. At first, the nobleman stood still, his hands raised in prayer, trying not to move. For a moment, the cobras simply circled him, their hoods wide, their hiss like the voice of death itself. Then, as if on some unseen signal, one struck his side. His eyes flew open, his prayer breaking into a guttural cry. The chamber became a storm of movement as serpents lunged in turn. He stumbled, flailing against their coils, but resistance only brought more attacks. Soon, his body sagged, his lips foaming as venom flooded his veins. His defiance, so steady above ground, dissolved into the dust of the pit. The Maharaja gave a nod, and the guards pulled the body out with iron hooks, It was tossed aside as if it were nothing more than a broken weapon. The king's message was clear. Power was not only about conquering armies, it was about ruling through terror that pierced deeper than any blade. The crowd shifted uneasily, some unable to look, others transfixed by the macabre ritual. Parents covered the eyes of their children, while warriors clenched their jaws, silently vowing never to betray their sovereign. The pit of snakes was more than punishment. It was a living legend of fear. As twilight fell, the torches around the pit flickered with crimson light. The Maharaja rose from his throne, his silks trailing behind him as he descended toward the chamber to look upon his serpentine executioners. The snakes hissed in unison, as though greeting their master. He looked down at them with a strange reverence. These creatures, worshipped in the old cults, had become his servants in death. The pit was not just an execution ground, it was a throne beneath the earth, where fear ruled more completely than any king of men could above. The guards sealed the pit with heavy stone slabs, leaving the serpents to coil in silence, waiting for the next soul to fall among them. Above ground, the air grew hushed, for the people knew that as long as the Maharaja ruled, the pit of snakes would never be empty. The night was alive with music and feasting elsewhere in the palace, but beneath the ground, the hissing never stopped. It was the reminder of a ruler's will, a terror carved into the hearts of all who lived under his command. Dawn broke with crimson light spilling across the palace walls, but inside the court, silence reigned. The memory of the pit lingered in every mind, and whispers of its horror spread through the city streets. Merchants, priests, and warriors alike spoke the same truth. Disobedience meant the embrace of serpents. Yet for the Maharaja, the pit was not just an instrument of death, it was a theater of power. He summoned his court at sunrise, demanding their presence at the balcony above the pit. His smile was calm, but his eyes burned with the thrill of control. He declared that another spectacle would be held that very day. Among those dragged before him was a young prince from a conquered land. Barely 20, the boy had been captured during a failed rebellion. His chains clinked as he stood before the throne, his defiance faltering under the gaze of the ruler who had destroyed his kingdom. The boy's mother, a queen taken hostage months earlier, was forced to attend the gathering. Her silks were torn, her jewels pawned by the victors, but her pride remained unbroken. She knelt before the Maharaja, begging him to spare her son, offering her own life in exchange. The Maharaja's laughter echoed coldly through the chamber. "Your life has no worth compared to the lesson your son's screams will teach," he said. The queen's tears fell silently, but she dared not plead further, for she knew her words would only sharpen his cruelty. The prince was dragged toward the pit, his jaw clenched though his hands shook. From above, courtiers leaned over the railing, some eager, others uneasy. The hiss of serpents below reached their ears like a chant of doom, growing louder as the iron gate was opened. The young man's eyes widened as he looked down into the writhing mass of snakes. The sight hollowed his courage, but he did not cry out. He turned his gaze upward, seeking his mother's eyes. She tried to look strong for him, but her trembling betrayed the storm inside her heart. Guards pushed him down the stairs, his feet dragging against the stone. He stumbled but caught himself, refusing to fall before his captors. When he reached the chamber floor, the torches revealed his pale face and the shifting coils that surrounded him like rivers of shadow. The serpents stirred, lifting their heads, their bodies weaving in eerie unison. The boy stood frozen, his breaths quickening. He tried to steady himself, whispering a warrior's prayer, but the words came out broken, as though even the gods could not hear him here. A cobra slithered close, circling him like a predator savoring its prey. Its hood spread wide, tongue flickering against the air. The boy flinched as it brushed against his leg, but he stood still, hoping stillness might delay the inevitable. The crowd above leaned in, the silence heavy. The queen pressed her fists to her lips, praying her son might be spared a painful end. But mercy was no companion of serpents. In a swift blur, the cobra struck, its fangs sinking into his calf. The prince's cry broke through the air, echoing in the pit. He staggered, clutching the wound, only for another snake to coil around his arm, sinking its teeth into his flesh. He thrashed, falling to his knees, venom coursing into his blood like fire. The queen screamed his name, her voice breaking as she tried to throw herself over the railing. Guards restrained her, pulling her back as she fought like a madwoman. Her cries filled the chamber, but they could not pierce the cruelty of the king's command. Below, the boy's body convulsed, his skin paling as venom spread. He gasped, his lips foaming, his hands clawing at the air as though grasping for a life that was slipping away. His eyes locked on his mother one last time before they rolled back, his body collapsing among the serpents. The pit hissed in triumph as if the snakes themselves had feasted on more than flesh. They had devoured the hopes of a dynasty. The guards hauled the lifeless body out with hooks, tossing it aside while the queen fainted against their arms. The Maharaja rose, his silks glowing in the torchlight. "Let all rulers know," he proclaimed, "that rebellion breeds only death." His words carried across the chamber, striking both friend and foe with the certainty that no mercy existed in his reign. But even among his loyal generals, unease began to stir. Some wondered if the pit was a curse disguised as power, for though it destroyed enemies, it also consumed the humanity of those who watched, leaving behind only fear and silence. Later that night, the queen was locked in a cold chamber, her son's scream still echoing in her mind. She pressed her hands to her chest, whispering to the gods for vengeance. In her grief, she vowed that one day, even the Maharaja would fall into the pit he had built. The snakes below never slept. Their coils shifted endlessly, their hissing rising like a lullaby of death through the cracks in the stone. Even the palace guards claimed they could hear it in the silence of midnight, as though the pit itself whispered promises of more blood. The Maharaja, however, retired to his chambers with pride. To him, the snakes were his truest soldiers, obedient, merciless, eternal. He drank his wine with satisfaction, believing his terror would last for centuries. But shadows gathered in silence. For every enemy thrown into the pit, more hatred grew outside the walls. The queen's vow was not hers alone. Whispers of rebellion brewed in secret, carried by those who saw the pit not as justice, but as monstrous cruelty. And beneath the earth, the serpents waited, patient and timeless. For the pit did not care who fell into it. King or prisoner, noble or slave, all who touched its floor were the same to the fangs of the cobras. The monsoon clouds rolled across the horizon, heavy with rain, as if the heavens themselves brooded over the kingdom. Within the palace walls, the air was thick, not only with dampness, but with whispers of rebellion. Servants, merchants, even soldiers began to murmur that the king's cruelty had awakened the wrath of the gods. The queen, imprisoned in her chamber, became a symbol of silent resistance. Though guarded day and night, her grief and defiance seeped into the hearts of the people. Mothers wept for her, fathers clenched their fists, and priests muttered prayers for justice to descend upon the tyrant. The Maharaja, however, noticed none of this. His obsession with power only deepened. Night after night, he descended to the pit alone, staring at the serpents as though they were his children. He would whisper to them, calling them his army of shadows, convinced that fear was greater than loyalty. But the court grew restless. Generals who once praised him now avoided his gaze. Advisors spoke carefully, fearful that a misplaced word might condemn them to the fangs. The pit had turned from a tool of order into a well of dread that poisoned every corner of the palace. One night during a storm, lightning split the skies, shaking the fortress with thunder. It was then that conspirators struck. Guards loyal to the queen unlocked her chamber, guiding her through hidden corridors. She emerged pale but fierce, her vow for vengeance burning brighter than ever. In the throne room, the conspirators gathered in silence. They knew that to strike at the Maharaja openly was suicide, but to use his own terror against him, that was justice. Their plan was whispered in hurried tones. The king would taste the pit himself. The following morning, the Maharaja convened his court, declaring that a rebel noble had been captured. He ordered another demonstration in the pit, eager to remind his people that his power was unshakable. But the noble was a phantom, a bait drawn from lies. The true trap was for the king. As he descended with his entourage, the storm rumbled above, shaking the palace stones. The pit was opened, the torches lit, the snakes stirred. The hiss filled the chamber like the chanting of unseen priests. The king raised his hand to silence the crowd, his pride swelling. But before he could order the condemned forward, a dozen guards turned their spears inward. Gasps rippled through the court as steel was leveled, not at prisoners, but at the throne. The conspirators had revealed themselves, and at their side stood the queen, her eyes burning with a mother's fury. The Maharaja staggered back in disbelief. He barked orders, but many of his loyal guards faltered, unwilling to fight. The conspirators advanced, their leader declaring, "You have fed too many to the serpents. Now it is your turn to hear their judgment." The queen stepped forward, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "You made me watch as my son was devoured. You reveled in his screams. Tonight, the pit will sing for you." Her words cut sharper than any blade. The court fell silent, all eyes on the trembling ruler. The king tried to retreat, but strong arms seized him. His crown slipped from his head, rolling across the stone floor. He roared in rage, thrashing against his captors, but he was dragged inexorably toward the stairway of the pit. The hiss of serpents grew louder, as if they sensed the moment. Torches cast long shadows across the walls, and the carved serpents seemed to come alive in the flickering light. The king, once master of fear, now felt it coil around him like a constrictor's grip. He begged, his voice cracking, offering gold, armies, kingdoms. But the conspirators were unmoved, and the queen watched in silence, her tears drying into a mask of cold resolve. His words, once commands, had become the babble of a desperate man. At the base of the stairs, the guards stripped him of his jeweled robes, leaving him in nothing but his trembling flesh. He stared into the pit, where coils shifted and heads rose, their hoods wide. His knees buckled, and for the first time in his reign, the king knew terror. They threw him in. He landed hard against the stone, gasping as the snakes stirred around him. Their tongues flickered across his skin, their bodies coiling close. He flailed, shrieking, his cries echoing against the chamber walls. The court above watched in frozen awe. The same spectacle he had forced upon countless victims now unfolded before their eyes, but this time the tyrant was the prey. The snakes struck, one after another, their fangs sinking into the flesh of the man who had once ruled them through fear. His screams turned to wails, then to gurgled gasps. His body convulsed, his limbs thrashing wildly, but each movement drew more strikes. The pit became a storm of scales and venom, drowning his power in agony. The queen leaned over the railing, her voice calm as she whispered, "For my son." Her words carried down to him, though his eyes rolled back, his body collapsing beneath the weight of serpents. In moments, the king was no more. Silence fell, broken only by the hissing of the pit. The conspirators sealed the chamber, but the legend of that night spread far beyond the palace walls. It was said that the snakes had claimed their true master at last, and that the pit had drunk the fear of a king. From that day forward, the pit was abandoned. Stones were laid over it, prayers whispered to seal its curse. Yet travelers and villagers swore that on stormy nights, if you stood near the palace ruins, you could hear the faint hiss of serpents beneath the earth.